My own daughter shoved me down a flight of concrete stairs and walked away. As I lay in the dark with a shattered hip, her husband peered down from the landing and told her to leave me there to die. But before the darkness took me, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and placed one single call. What followed wiped them off the map entirely. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 65 years old, and this is how I brought down the monsters I'd welcomed into my own home. Welcome to Grandpa's Revenge, where the stories are real, the stakes are high, and justice has a long memory. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found your way. If you've been sitting with me for a while, you already know how these stories tend to end. Either way, tap that subscribe button, so the next story comes straight to you. No searching required. I do want to ask you something before we go any further. Is this the first story you've heard on this channel, or have you been here long enough to know that I don't let things go quietly? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Now, a brief note. Some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. The argument that changed everything started with a glossy piece of paper. I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, a storage box in my arms, when Nadine stepped directly into my path and pressed a cheap, badly printed brochure hard against my chest. The bold letters on the front read, Pine Brook Care Center. I didn't need to open it to understand what I was holding. It was a state-funded low-income facility for the destitute, a place where forgotten people went to wait for the end. I looked at my 28-year-old daughter. She was wearing the sapphire pendant necklace I bought her for her college graduation. Arms crossed, she stared back at me with eyes completely stripped of warmth. She told me it was time to be realistic. She said I was getting too old to manage the house, that my slight limp from an old knee surgery was a liability. She demanded I sign over the deed to my 4-bedroom home to her and her husband Bryce. They needed the equity to fund their lifestyle upgrades. I reminded her that this house was mine, free and clear. I reminded her that I'd let them move in rent-free 2 years ago, so Bryce could chase his failing tech startup. I had handed them the master bedroom and moved myself into the guest room. I covered the property taxes, I covered the groceries, I covered every utility bill that came through the door. I asked her how she could stand in my own hallway and tell me I was the one who needed to go. Bryce walked out of the kitchen. He was holding a cup of coffee I had brewed. He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run cold. He told me I had until the end of the week to sign the transfer papers, or he'd stuff my belongings into garbage bags and dump them on the front lawn. He said I was legally just a tenant, and he'd change the locks while I was out. A wave of pure disgust rolled through me. I understood then that I wasn't speaking to family. I was dealing with parasites. I set down the storage box. I told them both to pack their things and get out. The free ride was finished, and they had until midnight to vacate my property. I reached past Nadine toward the landline on the hallway table. I was going to call the police and have them removed. Nadine panicked. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. She didn't just block my reach. She planted both palms flat on my chest and shoved me with everything she had. My heel caught the edge of the top step. Gravity took hold instantly. I fell backward into the dark stairwell. My shoulders slammed into the sharp wooden edge of the third step. I tumbled out of control. I felt my ribs crack as I struck the railing. I hit the solid concrete floor at the bottom with a sickening impact. The pain was immediate and blinding, a sharp burning agony detonating through my right hip. I heard the bone give way. Every bit of air was driven from my lungs. I lay on the freezing concrete, staring up at the rectangle of light at the top of the stairs. I couldn't move. Every attempt to shift my weight sent shockwaves of nausea crashing through me. I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard footsteps approaching the edge of the landing. I forced my eyes open. Nadine and Bryce were looking down at me. Nadine had her hand pressed over her mouth. She looked frightened, but not for me. She looked frightened because of what she had done. Bryce didn't look frightened at all. He looked inconvenienced. I tried to ask for help. What came out was a ragged wheeze. Bryce wrapped his hand around the doorknob. He looked down at me in the dark and delivered a line I will carry until the day I die. He said, "Maybe now he will get the message, let him die down there." He pulled the door shut. The basement was swallowed in absolute blackness. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a heavy click. A moment later, the muffled rumble of their car engine drifted in from the driveway. They were leaving for their weekend anniversary trip, a luxury resort in Sonoma Valley, a getaway I had paid for as a gift 3 months ago. They were driving away and leaving me on that concrete floor with a shattered hip, fully expecting me to bleed out or die of dehydration before they came back on Sunday. The silence of the basement pressed down like a weight. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional pain was its own distinct agony. I lay on the cold concrete and let the truth of my situation settle over me. I did not scream for help. There was no one to hear it. The thick walls of my house swallowed all sound. Screaming would only burn through my remaining strength. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. I had to separate the physical wreckage from my mind. There in that dark, freezing basement, Gerald the father died. The man who had sat up through the night rocking a sick baby was gone. The man who had written check after check to cover Bryce's business disasters was gone. The father who had made excuses for his daughter's cruelty was lying dead on that concrete. In his place, something cold and calculating opened its eyes. I no longer felt sorrow. The urge to cry had vanished entirely. What I felt instead was a deep glacial clarity. My entire relationship with my daughter had been a transaction. I was an ATM. When the machine stopped dispensing money and refused to surrender the vault, they decided to destroy the machine. They were not going to destroy me. I was going to take their lives apart piece by piece with surgical precision. I knew exactly how brittle their world was, because I was the only thing holding it together. Bryce believed he was a visionary entrepreneur. He believed he had secured millions in venture capital for his startup. What he didn't know was that the anonymous holding company bankrolling his ambitions was entirely under my control. I had quietly funneled my own retirement funds into his business through a proxy protecting his ego. That contract contained severe morality clauses. One signature from me could freeze every asset he owned. I forced my left hand into my trouser pocket. Every millimeter of movement felt like broken glass grinding through my hip. Sweat ran down my face in the freezing air. It took 3 agonizing minutes to work the emergency cell phone free. I gripped it tight. I did not dial emergency services first. If I called the police right now, they'd charge Nadine with simple assault. Bryce would use the startup funds I'd supplied to hire a lawyer. They'd make bail. They'd fight me in court. They'd call it an accident. I wanted them to lose everything. I wanted total financial and social annihilation. I unlocked the phone and dialed a private number. It rang twice. Stuart Aldrich picked up. Stuart had been my corporate attorney for 30 years. He was a ruthless, razor-sharp man who had helped me build and sell my logistics empire. He knew every secret I kept. He knew the full architecture of the holding company. I spoke slowly, forcing each word out through the pain. I told him to execute Protocol Omega. Stuart went completely silent for 2 seconds. Protocol Omega was a contingency plan we had drawn up years earlier. It meant I was under serious threat and needed the immediate unilateral transfer of all my assets into an impenetrable trust. It meant triggering the destruction clauses on every conditional investment, including Bryce's company. Stuart asked where I was and what had happened. I told him I was locked in my own basement with a broken hip and my daughter had put me there. I told him to lock down the accounts, transfer the deed of my house into the commercial trust, and then call an ambulance to my address. I ended the call and let the phone drop onto the concrete. The trap was set. The machinery of their destruction was already in motion. Now I only had to survive the night. 30 minutes later, the silence was torn apart by the sound of heavy boots on my front porch. I heard the loud, commanding voices of paramedics. I heard the crack and splinter of wood as they forced the front door. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. The deadbolt on the basement door was smashed open. Flashlight beams sliced through the darkness and hit my eyes. 2 paramedics came thundering down the stairs, radios crackling. They dropped to their knees beside me, calling out my injuries to each other in clipped medical shorthand. The paramedics carefully stabilized my neck and started setting up a backboard. A police officer came down the stairs, sweeping his flashlight across the room. He took in the locked door, then looked down at me. He asked me point blank what had happened and who had locked that door. I met his eyes. My hip was screaming. My vision was going soft at the edges. I knew that one word from me would put squad cars on the highway intercepting Nadine and Bryce before they cleared the county line. But that wasn't the plan. The plan required them to believe they had won. The plan required them to walk back into this house convinced they owned the world. I drew a shallow breath and lied. I told the officer I'd tripped in the dark while moving some things. I said the door must have swung shut on its own and the old lock jammed. The officer looked doubtful, but he wrote it down. The paramedics transferred me to the stretcher. The pain knocked me out for a few seconds. When I came back around, they were sliding me into the ambulance. Cold night air washed over my face. I looked back at the house. The front door hung open, splintered off its frame. The place was empty. Nadine and Bryce were raising glasses in Sonoma Valley, toasting to my end. They had absolutely no idea that while they celebrated, I had already wiped out everything they were counting on. I let my eyes close as the sirens started up, ready to run the next phase of the operation from a hospital bed. I surfaced from the deep chemical sleep of anesthesia like something breaking through ice. The recovery room's harsh fluorescent lights burned through my eyelids. A steady beeping marked my pulse. I tried to adjust my position, and a vicious bolt of pain tore through my right side. My hip was heavily wrapped, radiating a dull, throbbing heat. The surgeon had spent 4 grueling hours rebuilding the shattered bone with titanium plates and heavy medical screws. I was flat on my back, temporarily crippled, but my mind was cleaner and sharper than it had been in years. I found the digital clock on the pale green wall. Tuesday morning. 2 days had passed since my daughter shoved me down those stairs. 2 days since Nadine and Bryce locked the door and drove away. They were still in Sonoma Valley, sipping expensive wine on my tab, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath them was cracking open. A sharp knock pulled me out of my thoughts. The door swung wide, and a man in a rumpled brown suit stepped into the room. He carried a thick manila folder in one hand and a steaming paper cup in the other. He flashed a silver badge on his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Coffee from the local precinct. His face was weathered, his eyes alert and measuring. He dragged a plastic chair to my bedside and sat down without offering a single hollow word of sympathy. He opened the folder and produced the incident report filed by the responding officers. He fixed me with a level, unreadable stare. He told me the paramedics had needed a heavy steel battering ram to get through my front door. He said they'd found me unconscious at the foot of the basement stairs with a severe compound fracture. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and laid out the most glaring problem in the entire police report. The basement door, he said, had been deadbolted from the hallway side. Detective Coffee asked me how a man goes downstairs to move some things and ends up with a heavy deadbolt thrown against him from the outside. He studied my expression for any flicker of panic or deception. He mentioned that the responding officer had noted the house was completely empty. He asked precisely where my daughter and son-in-law were at the time of the incident. He was fishing. He suspected elder abuse. His instincts were dead right. If I told him what actually happened on that landing, he would have a felony warrant issued before lunch. Nadine would be pulled from her resort in handcuffs. But a simple assault charge wasn't what I was after. The broken system would hand her a favorable plea deal. Bryce would reach into the startup funds I had secretly provided and hire a formidable defense attorney. They would frame me as a confused old man and skate away with a slap on the wrist. I needed them feeling completely untouchable, so they'd walk straight into the financial guillotine I had built for them. I arranged my face into an expression of deep embarrassment. I let my voice carry a faint tremor, stepping into the role of a frail, muddled old man. I gazed down at my pale hands on the blanket and released a long, unsteady sigh. I told Detective Coffee I had simply been getting clumsy with age. I explained that the house was old, that the basement door had a faulty temperamental latch. I said I'd left the door propped open to move the storage box, but a strong draft from an open window must have banged it shut. I claimed the force of the impact caused the deadbolt to snap into place, trapping me inside the stairwell. I said I panicked in the dark, caught my own feet, and went down the steep wooden steps. It was a humiliating story. It cast me as helpless and dangerously unsteady. It tasted like ash to speak it aloud, but I delivered every word without flinching. Detective Coffee was far from convinced. He tapped his metal pen against the folder in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He told me forensic evidence indicated the deadbolt was fully and firmly engaged, which almost always requires a deliberate human hand. He asked me one final time whether anyone else had been in the house with me that afternoon. He offered protection if I was frightened of someone in my own family. I held his gaze and shook my head slowly. I told him Nadine and Bryce had left for an anniversary trip, well before I started moving things around. I insisted the fault was entirely mine, and asked him specifically not to disturb my daughter during her vacation. The detective held his silence for a long moment. He understood I was not going to hand him the statement he needed to open a criminal case. Without a cooperating victim, there was nothing legally he could do. He closed the folder with a sharp clipped snap. He got to his feet, drew a crisp business card from his jacket, and set it on the tray table beside my bed. He told me to call his direct line the moment my recollection of events happened to improve. He walked out, and the door swung shut behind him, leaving me alone with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. I picked up his card and tucked it beneath my pillow. The false baseline was locked in. The police inquiry was neutralized, at least for now. Nadine and Bryce would come home Sunday, certain they had gotten away with attempted murder. They would assume I was too broken and too afraid to speak. Their towering arrogance would be the thing that destroyed them. My attorney was already moving the assets and sealing the trusts. The trap was fully set and waiting in the dark. All I had to do now was be patient and let the rats find their way back home. The door clicked shut, and I was left in the sterile quiet of the hospital room. The beeping of the monitor was the only sound. I stared up at the blank white ceiling. The painkillers were clawing at the edges of my consciousness, trying to drag me under, but I wouldn't let them. I had to stay sharp. Every throb of pain pulsing from my surgically repaired hip was a clear reminder of the mission. I wasn't simply a victim healing in a hospital bed. I was an architect with a demolition to finish. My thoughts drifted to Bryce. I saw his smug face staring down at me in that dark basement. Bryce genuinely believed he was a titan of industry. He walked through my house in tailored British suits, helping himself to my expensive scotch, talking loudly into his phone about synergy and market disruption. He was convinced he was a self-made millionaire, on the edge of transforming the world with his software company. The sheer scale of his delusion was breathtaking. Bryce was not a genius. He was a parasite in a silk tie. 3 years back, Bryce was drowning in debt. His first 2 ventures had collapsed, completely sunk, by his own incompetence and arrogance. He had burned through every dollar he owned. He had quietly drained my daughter's college fund, the one I had generously signed over to her when she married him. They were inches from total bankruptcy. Nadine had come to me one night sobbing in the kitchen. She begged me to save them. She pleaded with me to put money into Bryce's new tech venture, insisting it was his last real shot at proving himself. I had just closed the sale of my commercial logistics empire. I had more liquid capital than 3 lifetimes could burn through, but I understood that simply writing Bryce a check would crush whatever fragment of self-respect he had left, and he would despise me for it. I wanted to protect my daughter's marriage. I wanted to give them something solid to stand on. So I made the greatest mistake of my life. I chose to help them in complete secrecy. I brought Stuart Aldrich into my private study. We spent 3 days building a financial apparatus that could not be traced back to me. We created a shadow entity called Meridian Crest Ventures, an anonymous holding company registered offshore, buried beneath layers of impenetrable corporate privacy law. On paper, it looked like a ruthless elite venture capital firm. In reality, it was just me at my mahogany desk, bankrolling my arrogant son-in-law with my own retirement savings. Meridian Crest Ventures formally approached Bryce with an investment offer. We injected $3 million in seed capital into his struggling software company. I will never forget the afternoon Bryce came charging into my living room, waving the term sheet in the air. The man was practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. He boasted that a major institutional investor had finally recognized his exceptional brilliance. He told me that traditional businessmen like me simply couldn't grasp the modern digital economy. I smiled, offered my congratulations, and poured him a glass of my finest whiskey. I let him believe he was royalty. That $3 million turned Bryce and Nadine into something unrecognizable. They leased luxury vehicles and left them sitting in my driveway. They bought designer clothing and packed my closets with it. They began traveling to Europe and the Caribbean on lavish getaways. And while they burned through my hidden money without a second thought, their contempt for me sharpened with each passing week. They moved into my house under the pretense of cutting expenses, claiming they needed to funnel their personal income back into the business. They commandeered the master suite. They pushed me down the hall to the small guest room. They began treating me like a nuisance and before long, like a despised servant. They had completely forgotten that I was the one covering the property taxes and the grocery bills. My very existence had become an inconvenience to their glamorous lives. But I was not a naive old fool. A man doesn't build a major logistics empire by writing blank checks on blind faith. I was a pragmatic businessman who had spent decades studying the darkest corners of human nature. When Stuart Aldrich drafted the venture capital contract for Meridian Crest Ventures, I made sure a very specific legal mechanism was embedded in it. Deep inside those 70 pages of dense corporate language sat an ironclad morality and ethical conduct clause. That clause was a financial guillotine, plain and simple. It stipulated that if the company's founder engaged in any illegal activity, displayed severe moral turpitude, or was implicated in elder abuse, Meridian Crest Ventures held the unilateral right to freeze all operating accounts without notice. Beyond that, the clause granted the holding company immediate authority to seize all company assets, intellectual property, and any personal collateral tied to the business. Bryce never read that contract with any care. He was too dazzled by the $3 million figure sitting at the top of the page. He signed his own death warrant 3 years ago with no idea whatsoever that his father-in-law was the one holding the pen. When I lay bleeding on that freezing basement floor and told Stuart Aldrich to execute Protocol Omega, I released the blade of that guillotine. At this very moment, while Bryce was most likely stretched out beside a resort pool in Sonoma Valley, a team of forensic accountants and hard-edged corporate lawyers were dismantling his entire existence. His business bank accounts were sitting at an absolute zero balance. His corporate credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. The servers running his software were being legally seized. He was a thoroughly ruined man. He just hadn't opened his email yet. I checked the digital clock on the hospital wall. It was nearly noon. Their anniversary trip was supposed to wrap up today. The resort would have run his corporate card for the final bill. It would decline. He'd try another. That one would decline too. Panic would take hold. They would race back to the city, bewildered by the sudden collapse of everything they owned. And then it would dawn on them the old man they had left locked in the basement. They would come straight to the hospital. They needed me now more than they ever had. They needed my house. They needed me to sign over the property deed so they could liquidate it fast enough to plug the inexplicable hole where their finances used to be. They would walk through that hospital door wearing flawless masks of concern. Nadine would take my hand and manufacture tears. Bryce would position himself in the corner as the steady, supportive husband. They would have the low-income nursing home paperwork ready, counting on intimidation to force my signature. I adjusted myself against the stiff hospital pillows. I drew a slow breath and pushed past the sharp pull of pain from my ribs. I was entirely ready. I had spent a lifetime constructing businesses, but this was going to be my greatest work. I would look my daughter straight in the eyes, smile graciously, and give her exactly what she was asking for, knowing full well it would haul her directly into a hell of her own design. The heavy hospital room door swung open with a bang. Nadine rushed in gasping as though she had just sprinted across the parking lot. Bryce came in right behind her. They were both still dressed in their resort clothes from Sonoma Valley. Nadine had a designer silk scarf looped around her neck, and her cheeks were flushed. She flung herself across my bed, burying her face against my shoulder and breaking into loud theatrical sobbing. She wailed my name and cried about how terrified she had been the moment she got the call from the hospital. Bryce stood at the foot of the bed, resting a hand on her back and composing his face into a mask of grave, solemn worry. A young floor nurse had trailed them in, holding a clipboard. She looked at my daughter with obvious sympathy. She gently touched Nadine's arm and murmured that I was going to be fine, that the surgery had gone well. Nadine lifted her face to the nurse tears, streaming down her perfectly made-up cheeks. She thanked her again and again, playing the role of the devoted and devastated daughter without missing a single note. She talked about how deeply they loved me and how they had dropped everything and rushed back the instant they heard the dreadful news. I lay perfectly still against the pillows. I endured the sickening pressure of her body against my wrecked hip. I said nothing. I simply watched the performance unfold, genuinely fascinated by the sheer scale of her sociopathic lying. The nurse checked my intravenous drip, gave us all a warm smile, and slipped out of the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The click of the latch rang out in the silence. The transformation was instantaneous and chilling. The very second that door closed, Nadine stopped crying. She pushed herself upright, wiped the manufactured tears from her face, and straightened the front of her silk blouse. The expression of anguish vanished from Bryce's face and was replaced at once by cold, calculating annoyance. He glanced at his engraved pocket watch, folded his arms, and leaned back against the cinder block wall. The loving family act dissolved entirely, leaving only the two parasites I had welcomed into my home. Nadine produced a sleek leather folder from her designer bag and dropped it onto my tray table with a heavy thud. She flipped it open to reveal a stack of legal documents and the same glossy brochure for Pinebrook Care Center that had ignited this entire nightmare 2 days earlier. She drew a silver pen from her purse and set it down deliberately beside the papers. She did not ask how the surgery had gone. She did not ask about my pain level. She looked directly at me with a gaze cold enough to freeze water. She said the doctors had told her I would require months of physical therapy and round-the-clock care. She stated that neither she nor Bryce had any intention of serving as my nurses. She pressed her perfectly manicured fingernail against the top document. It was a voluntary transfer of medical and financial power of attorney bundled with admission papers for the low-income state facility. Attached to it was a quitclaim deed signing my 4-bedroom home over to her outright. I looked at the papers, then I looked back at her. I asked her what on earth made her think I would ever sign my life away to the people who left me to bleed out on a concrete floor. Bryce let out a short, cruel laugh from his corner of the room. He crossed to my bedside and stared down at me with undisguised contempt. He said I didn't have a choice anymore. He told me they had already spoken to the officers downstairs. A wicked, triumphant smile spread across his face as he thanked me for lying to the detective. He said my story about tripping in the dark and locking myself in the basement was the greatest gift I could have handed them. Nadine leaned in until her face was inches from mine. I could smell expensive wine on her breath. Her voice dropped to a cold serpentine whisper. She told me that if I refused to sign these papers right now, she would go straight to a judge. She said she would take my own police statement and use it to demonstrate I was suffering from severe dementia and cognitive decline. She threatened to have me declared legally incompetent and a danger to myself. She promised that if she had to pursue emergency conservatorship through the courts, she would not put me in Pinebrook Care Center. She vowed to find the most underfunded, squalid psychiatric ward in the entire state and seal me away in a padded room where no one would ever hear from me again. She pressed the silver pen into my right hand. She folded my fingers around the cold metal shaft. She told me to stop being stubborn and accept reality. She said I had lived a full life, but my time was finished, and it was their turn to enjoy my wealth. She ordered me to sign the documents and be grateful they were even managing my transition. This was the moment I had been building toward. I needed them to believe they had broken me completely. I needed them to feel a false and total sense of victory. I let my hand begin to tremble violently. I let my breathing turn fast and shallow, mimicking a panic attack. I flicked my eyes between the two of them, projecting raw, unmistakable terror. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a single weak tear down my cheek. I whispered that they couldn't do this to me. I pleaded with them in a fragile, crumbling voice to just let me go home. Bryce sneered in disgust. He grabbed the bed frame and gave it a sharp shake, sending a blinding spike of pain through my hip. He told me to shut up and sign the papers before he left me to rot in this bed. I kept my hand shaking. I lowered the tip of the silver pen slowly toward the signature line of the first document. I paused, letting out a soft, defeated sob. Nadine tapped the paper impatiently. I pressed the pen down and signed. I turned to the next page and signed again. I signed away my medical rights. I signed the admission forms for the wretched nursing home. I signed the quitclaim deed to my home. I signed every page they put in front of me, making sure the handwriting looked unsteady and broken. When I completed the final signature, the pen slipped from my shaking fingers and rattled to the floor. I let my head drop back against the pillow and closed my eyes, performing the role of a man who had just forfeited everything that mattered to him. Nadine snatched the documents off the tray table. She checked every signature with meticulous intensity, a look of pure, greedy satisfaction spreading across her face. She slid the papers back into the leather folder and snapped it shut. She looked at Bryce and gave a single nod. The transaction was complete. They had stripped me of everything they believed was theirs to take. Nadine didn't offer one word of comfort. She didn't say goodbye. She turned her back and walked briskly toward the door. Bryce followed, pausing only long enough to glance back at me a final time. He offered a mocking salute, flashed his arrogant smile, and disappeared into the hallway. The heavy door swung closed and left me alone in the silence. I opened my eyes. The trembling in my hands stopped immediately. The mask of terror dissolved from my face without a trace. I reached beneath the hospital pillow and retrieved the burner phone I had stashed there. The papers I had just signed were entirely without legal force, completely void. Void because 12 hours earlier, my attorney Stuart Aldrich had already legally transferred every asset I owned, including the house, into an irrevocable commercial trust that I held no direct control over. My medical power of attorney had been formally reassigned to Stuart Aldrich earlier that same morning. Nadine and Bryce believed they were walking out of this hospital as millionaires. They believed they owned my home. They thought they controlled my medical future. In reality, they were leaving with a folder stuffed full of worthless paper, heading back to a house they no longer owned, propped up by a company that had already been legally dismantled. I dialed Stuart Aldrich's number. The illusion was finished. It was time for the midnight escape. The clock on the wall read 11:45. The ward was completely silent aside from the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoes on the hallway floor. In exactly 8 hours, a transport van from Pinebrook Care Center would arrive to collect me. Nadine had booked it for 8 hours in the morning, wanting me disposed of before she and Bryce even rolled out of bed to enjoy the house they had stolen. They were certain I was trapped. They were certain my spirit was broken, and my assets were theirs to command. I lay in the dim light, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the forces I had set in motion. At exactly midnight, the heavy door to my room opened with a quiet click. It was not a nurse checking my vitals. A tall man in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit stepped into the room. It was Stuart Aldrich. My attorney did not have the look of a man paying a bedside visit to a sick friend. He carried himself like an executioner arriving for a scheduled appointment. Behind him walked a woman with a heavy leather briefcase, and behind her, a man in a crisp white medical uniform. Stuart moved to the side of my bed and looked down at me. His face was completely unreadable, a mask of total professional detachment. He offered no hollow words about my broken hip. He simply gave a single nod and said it was time to get to work. He introduced the woman as an independent notary public. He introduced the man as the lead of a private medical transport team waiting at the loading dock. Stuart snapped his briefcase open and arranged a thick stack of documents on my tray table. These were nothing like the cheap downloaded forms Nadine had thrust at me hours before. These were precisely drafted ironclad legal instruments built to dismantle my daughter's entire future. Stuart handed me a heavy silver fountain pen. He walked me through the first document. It was a full and immediate revocation of the medical and financial power of attorney I had just signed over to Nadine. Because I was currently of sound mind signing, before an independent legal notary, the documents Nadine was carrying were rendered null and void on the spot. I gripped the pen firmly. My hand did not shake. This time, my signature came down in slow, deliberate strokes. The notary stamped the page, and my daughter's fate was sealed. Stuart moved to the next document. It was the formal activation of the commercial trust. He explained that, as of this exact moment, my 4-bedroom home was the legal property of a corporate entity I did not directly manage. Nadine's quitclaim deed was worthless because I had not owned that property at the moment I signed it away. The new corporate owners had already issued a formal notice to vacate set to be delivered to the house in exactly 48 hours. I signed the transfer papers. The notary stamped them. Then came the final and most devastating document of all. Stuart drew out the Meridian Crest Ventures executive ledger and pointed to the clause governing Bryce's tech startup. He confirmed the morality clause had been triggered from the moment I phoned him from the basement floor. This final document authorized the immediate liquidation of all company assets to recover my original $3 million investment. My signature here would give Stuart the legal authority to drain Bryce's business accounts, seize his servers, and lock him out of his own office building before dawn. I looked at the signature line. I thought about Bryce staring down at me in the dark basement and telling my daughter to let me die down there. I did not hesitate for even a second. I signed the paper. The notary stamped it. The financial guillotine was fully armed, and the blade was falling. Stuart gathered the documents and secured them in his leather briefcase. He looked at me steadily and said the legal wall was built. Now, we needed to get me out of the hospital before the morning shift arrived. The medical transport specialist stepped forward. He explained calmly that he had already arranged my discharge directly with the hospital administration. Since I was legally competent and under the supervision of a private physician retained by Stuart, the hospital had no grounds to detain me. I was departing against medical advice, a move that completely sidestepped the transfer arrangements Nadine had put in place. The specialist gestured toward the hallway. 2 additional medical technicians came through the door wheeling in a high-end specialized transport stretcher. Getting me moved was an extraordinarily painful ordeal. Despite the careful coordinated hands working around me, the shift from the hospital bed onto the stretcher sent scorching waves of agony tearing through my newly reconstructed hip. I locked my jaw and fixed my gaze on the ceiling, determined not to make a sound. I had endured 2 days on a freezing concrete floor. A 5-minute transfer wasn't going to break me. They fastened me to the stretcher with heavy nylon straps and draped a thick, warm blanket over me. Stuart walked out into the hallway ahead of us, clearing the way. The technicians rolled my stretcher out of the room. We did not head toward the main lobby. Instead, we moved in silence down a dimly lit corridor toward the service elevators. We passed the nurses' station, where the night staff gave my attorney nothing more than a quiet nod. Money and influence can move mountains, and Stuart Aldrich knew exactly how to wield both. The elevator doors parted, and we descended into the hospital's basement. There was something poetic about it. My nightmare had begun in a dark basement, and here was my rebirth beginning in another. We came out through the loading dock doors. The cold night air swept across my face, carrying the smell of rain and wet asphalt. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever breathed in. A sleek, unmarked medical transport van sat waiting with its rear doors hanging open. They loaded me carefully into the back. Inside, it was like a mobile intensive care unit, brightly lit, packed with sophisticated medical equipment. Stuart stepped up to the open doors and looked at me one final time before we pulled away. He told me my new quarters at the private rehabilitation estate were fully prepared and tightly secured. He promised that by the time I opened my eyes tomorrow morning, Nadine and Bryce would be living in an entirely different reality. He stepped back and the heavy doors swung shut, sealing me inside a quiet, secure world. The van's engine turned over with a low rumble. We rolled out of the loading dock and eased onto the empty city streets. I watched through the small tinted window as the hospital shrank behind us. In just a few hours, the sun would come up. Nadine would wake inside my house with no idea she was already a trespasser. She would be waiting for the nursing home transport to call her hungry to hear that I had been locked away for good. Instead, she was going to find an empty hospital bed, an avoided legal contract, and Bryce would try to buy his morning coffee only to learn that his credit cards were dead plastic, and his entire company had been seized by an invisible hand. I closed my eyes and let the gentle rocking of the van carry me under. The pain in my hip was still there, but the suffocating weight of betrayal had lifted completely. I was no longer a victim waiting to be finished off. I was a ghost dissolving into the night, leaving behind a perfectly constructed trap for the people who thought they had buried me. I came awake to the sound of birds outside a massive bay window. Morning sunlight spilled across my bed, falling over a room that looked far more like a luxury hotel suite than any medical facility. The sterile corridors of the public hospital were behind me now. I was at the crest of a private, highly secure rehabilitation estate, tucked deep into wooded hills. Private security moved across the grounds. The gates opened only to a biometric scan. Nobody could locate me here. I was completely beyond the reach of the people who had wanted me dead. My physical therapist was a former military medic named Leon. He showed up at precisely 8 in the morning, carrying a custom walker and an expression of absolute determination. The next 2 hours were an exercise in pure agony. Leon pulled me out of that comfortable bed. He made me put weight on the reconstructed hip. Every single step sent shockwaves of fire racing up my spine. Sweat ran down my face. My muscles screamed, but I did not complain. I welcomed the pain. The physical torment was a necessary fire burning away the weak father I had once been. Every grueling step across that hardwood floor was another step toward my full restoration. I kept my mind locked on the image of Bryce standing at the top of my basement stairs. By the time Leon finally let me settle into the heavy leather recliner by the window, I was physically spent but mentally sharper than a blade. At exactly noon, the heavy mahogany door to my suite swung open. Stuart Aldrich walked in with his signature leather briefcase and a secure tablet. He turned my recovery room into a corporate command center on the spot. He pulled a chair up beside my recliner and opened the briefcase. The tranquil view of manicured gardens through the glass stood in stark contrast to the financial slaughter being orchestrated on the other side of the table. Stuart handed me a cup of black coffee and set a thick stack of finalized legal documents on the small table at my elbow. Then, he walked me through the morning's events. He told me the commercial trust had officially absorbed the deed to my house. The state registry was fully updated. Nadine and Bryce were now legally occupying a property held by a faceless corporate entity. Stewart offered a cold, measured smile. He informed me he had already dispatched the official 72-hour eviction notice through a private process server. The clock was ticking on their fraudulent domestic arrangement. I set down my coffee and reached for the heavy silver pen. Stewart placed the first document in front of me. It was the formal asset seizure authorization for Meridian Crest Ventures. Stewart explained that the forensic accounting team had spent the entire night mapping Bryce's corporate infrastructure. They had pinpointed his primary operating accounts, his payroll reserves, and his offshore tax shelters. I stared at the signature line. This single stroke of ink would instantly freeze $3 million. It would trigger automatic clawback protocols, legally draining every cent Bryce possessed to settle the breached investment contract. I pressed the pen to paper and signed my name with complete precision. Stewart slid the next document across. It was a formal directive to the bank holding Bryce's business credit cards, because the holding company had legally guaranteed those lines of credit activating the morality clause. Let me sever that guarantee on the spot. I signed the directive. In that exact moment, the plastic cards sitting in Bryce's expensive leather wallet became entirely worthless. The third document was a legal injunction against the servers hosting Bryce's tech startup. Stewart explained that since my holding company owned the intellectual property as collateral, we had every legal right to lock the entire system down pending a full audit. I signed the injunction. Thousands of lines of code and years of Bryce's supposed genius were instantly locked behind an impenetrable digital wall. He was shut out of his own creation entirely. I passed the pen back to Stewart. The physical ache in my hip was a dull throb completely eclipsed by the deep satisfaction of total control. I asked Stewart what the timeline was looking like. He checked his tablet and told me the bank freezes were already propagating across the financial network. The credit card cancellations would take effect in less than an hour. The server lockouts were happening in real time as we sat there. I settled back into the leather recliner and gazed out the window. Nadine and Bryce had returned from their lavish anniversary trip, expecting to find a frightened, compliant old man. They had spent 3 days living inside my house, sleeping in my bed, drinking my wine, completely unaware of the invisible net drawing tight around them. They believed they had won by shoving an old man down a flight of stairs. They had not grasped that the old man owned the stairs, the house, and every inch of ground beneath their feet. Stewart latched his briefcase and rose to leave. He told me the process server would deliver the eviction notice to the house tomorrow morning. He advised me to rest and concentrate on my physical therapy and promised to watch the financial collapse unfold from his office. I thanked him and watched him walk out. I was alone again, but I felt nothing close to lonely. What I felt was a profound, settled sense of purpose. I picked up my tablet and pulled up the live feed from the hidden security cameras I had installed around my property years before. I made myself comfortable and settled in to watch my daughter and her husband meet the complete destruction of everything they thought they had built. Nadine poured herself a double shot of espresso, using the imported Swiss machine sitting on my kitchen counter. She took a long, indulgent sip and looked out through the massive bay windows at the manicured backyard. It was Wednesday morning, just hours after they had forced me to put my name on those papers in that dim hospital room. She had on a spotless white silk robe, carrying herself exactly like the mistress of the house. There was not one trace of guilt anywhere in her. She felt no remorse for pushing her own father down a flight of concrete stairs. She felt no pity whatsoever for leaving me to waste away in a state-funded facility. All she felt was the intoxicating rush of wealth she hadn't earned. She turned to Bryce, who was parked at the custom mahogany dining table, fingers moving across his silver laptop. She told him they needed to move aggressively. She wanted the house on the market by Friday afternoon. She had calculated that my property sitting in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the county would pull in well over $2 million without much trouble. Bryce didn't lift his eyes from the screen. He simply nodded along, noting that a sudden cash infusion would let them step up to a massive downtown penthouse, while he expanded his software company at the same time. They were carving up my estate before I was even in the ground. They had arranged for Harriet Dunbar to come by the house for a 9:00 appointment. Harriet was the most ruthless, accomplished, and exclusive real estate broker in the city. She dealt exclusively in multi-million-dollar estates, and she was precisely the kind of shark Nadine wanted working on her stolen asset. Right on time, the heavy brass knocker at the front door sent an echo through the hallway. Nadine practically floated across the hardwood floor to answer it. Harriet stepped into the foyer, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and carrying a sleek leather portfolio. She radiated an air of total professional command. Nadine welcomed her with a sickeningly warm smile, offering coffee and pastries. Harriet politely waved off the refreshments. Her schedule was tight, she said, and she preferred to get straight down to business. Nadine eagerly steered Harriet through a grand tour of the property. She walked through my home, pointing out the architectural features, the vaulted ceilings, and the custom crown molding. But with every room they entered, Nadine made a point of insulting everything I had built. She called the expensive Turkish rugs tacky and dated. She told Harriet that the dark wood-paneled library smelled like an old man and needed to be gutted entirely. She performed like someone who had personally endured years of hardship and was now unveiling a hidden gem to the market. Bryce drifted along behind them, occasionally throwing in comments about the square footage, as though he had hammered the place together with his own hands. Harriet stayed perfectly neutral throughout. She made precise notes on her digital tablet, her eyes sweeping each room, calculating the market value of every corner. When the tour wrapped up, all three of them settled around the large dining room table. Nadine folded her hands and leaned in, practically trembling with greed. She asked Harriet what the opening listing price should be and how fast they could expect an all-cash offer to come in. Harriet didn't answer right away. She set her tablet on the table and opened a specific application. She tapped the screen several times, her manicured brow creasing with a hint of confusion. Something in the room shifted the bold, self-assured energy pouring off Nadine, and Bryce collided with a wall of professional hesitation. Harriet looked up from the screen and straightened in her seat. In a calm, measured tone, she asked Nadine to clarify her exact legal relationship to the property. Nadine let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. She declared proudly that she was the sole legal owner. She explained that her elderly father had recently suffered a terrible accident, undergone a serious mental decline, and had willingly signed the entire estate over to her just the night before. She spoke about my invented dementia with a chilling absence of feeling. Harriet did not smile. She turned the tablet around and slid it across the polished mahogany table so Nadine and Bryce could see the screen. Harriet explained that her brokerage runs a preliminary title search and public registry check before taking on any high-end listing standard practice, she said, to rule out hidden liens or legal complications. She directed a perfectly manicured finger at a highlighted section of the county database. According to the official state registry, she said updated at midnight, the property did not belong to Gerald Whitmore, and it certainly did not belong to Nadine or Bryce. The deed to the four-bedroom estate had been legally and irrevocably transferred to Meridian Crest Commercial Trust 2 full days ago. The silence that settled over the dining room was absolute and suffocating. Nadine stared at the glowing tablet screen. The words, Meridian Crest Commercial Trust, reflected back in her wide, panicked eyes. She blinked again and again, her mind completely unable to absorb what she was reading. Bryce leaned in, his jaw dropping slightly as he took in the official county seal confirming the digital record. The color drained from his face entirely. Nadine lurched to her feet, her chair shrieking across the hardwood floor. Her voice cracked as she shouted that the database was wrong, a clerical error, a stupid bureaucratic mistake. She practically ran to her designer handbag on the kitchen counter. She tore through it and yanked out the leather folder with the papers I had signed at the hospital. She flew back to the table, pulled out the quitclaim deed, and slammed it down in front of Harriet. She jabbed her finger at my unsteady signature, screaming that she had the physical proof of ownership right there in black and white. Harriet didn't flinch. She was a professional who navigated legal disputes every day. She picked up the hospital document and reviewed it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she set it back on the table and delivered the most devastating sentence my daughter had ever been forced to hear. Harriet explained that a quitclaim deed transfers only whatever interest a person holds in a property at the precise moment of signing. She looked Nadine squarely in the eyes and told her that when Gerald Whitmore signed that document at the hospital the previous night, he did not own the house. He had already transferred the property to the commercial trust a day prior. The hospital document was therefore completely worthless, a legally void piece of paper transferring absolutely nothing. Bryce grabbed the edge of the table. He began to hyperventilate. The realization hit him like a freight train. He knew that name, Meridian Crest. It was the same shadowy corporate entity that held the strings of his entire software company. The invisible hand that had bankrolled his life was the same hand that now owned the roof above his head. Harriet rose from her seat, her expression cold and detached. She slid her tablet into the leather portfolio and snapped it shut. She informed them that attempting to sell a property they had no legal claim to was a serious federal offense. Her brokerage would have absolutely nothing to do with this fraudulent listing. She didn't wait to be shown out. She turned on her heel, crossed the foyer in a few quick strides, and pulled the front door shut behind her, the heavy latch clicking with an awful finality. Nadine sank back into her chair. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The vision of her grand, wealthy future had shattered into pieces that could never be put back together. She looked across the table at Bryce. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face was gone entirely. He was staring blankly at the wall, his chest heaving. They weren't millionaires on the verge of buying a downtown penthouse. They were trespassers sitting inside a house that belonged to a hostile corporation. And they were about to find out that losing the house was only the opening wave of the tsunami. I watched the live security feed on my tablet as the front door of my house slammed shut. Harriet, the real estate broker, was gone, leaving my daughter and her husband in a state of complete shock. Through the hidden camera in the living room, I watched Bryce pace back and forth like a caged animal. The smug confidence he normally carried had been wiped clean off his face. He raked his hands through his hair and started shouting at Nadine. He told her that Meridian Crest Commercial Trust was nothing but a shell company trying to steal what was theirs. He still believed the world bent to his will. He snatched his car keys from the kitchen counter. He told Nadine he was heading downtown to his office. He promised her he was going to wire a massive financial retainer to the most aggressive litigation firm in the city. He was convinced he could hire a battalion of corporate lawyers to dismantle the trust and reclaim my house by sheer force. He stormed out the door, absolutely certain that his tech startup money made him untouchable. Bryce drove his expensive leased sports car into the downtown business district. I knew exactly what his office looked like because my hidden money had paid for every single square inch of it. He leased the top floor of a premium high-rise. He had furnished it with imported Spanish marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, and ridiculously expensive custom furniture. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what was really happening behind closed doors, what the people who betrayed me were doing, while they believed they had already won. The gap between what they showed the world and what they were actually doing is something I want you to sit with for a moment. If you ever suspected someone close to you was working against you in secret, would you confront them immediately, or would you watch and let them seal their own fate? He wanted the world to see a visionary tech billionaire. He stormed out of the private elevator and brushed past his receptionist without a glance in her direction. He was a tyrant who treated his staff with the same contemptuous disdain he had shown me in that basement. He locked the heavy glass door to his corner office, flung his jacket onto the leather sofa, and flipped open his sleek silver laptop. He went straight for the desk phone and called a high-powered defense attorney he knew from the country club. He promised the man a $100,000 wire transfer within the hour to launch an aggressive lawsuit against the trust. He put the lawyer on speakerphone and confidently typed in the web address for his executive corporate banking portal. He pulled up the primary operating account for his software company, the massive vault holding whatever remained of the $3 million I had quietly invested to salvage his miserable existence 3 years earlier. Bryce punched in his complex authorization credentials and hit enter, fully expecting a screen swimming in commas and zeros. The page loaded for 3 agonizing seconds. No balance appeared. A glaring red banner blazed across the full width of his expensive monitor. It read, "Error code 704, account frozen. Status restricted, available balance 0.00." Bryce stopped breathing. He sat there staring at the screen, his mind unable to make sense of what his eyes were showing him. He stabbed the refresh button. He typed his secure password a second time, hammering the keys so hard they clattered in the silence of the office. The same red banner came back. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. He navigated to the secondary payroll account he used to cover his engineers. Completely locked. Balance 0. He pulled up his offshore tax shelter. Access denied. Every digital vault connected to his name had been instantly and cleanly emptied. He cut the call with the high-powered lawyer without uttering a single word. His hands started shaking. He snatched his cell phone and dialed his elite platinum business banker. He bulldozed his way past the automated menu and demanded to speak with the regional corporate manager without delay. The manager picked up. His tone was nothing like the eager, fawning deference Bryce was used to receiving. It was ice-cold, purely administrative, stripped of any respect. Bryce nearly screamed into the receiver. He demanded to know why some absurd system glitch was tying up his critical business capital. He threatened to sue the bank and pull his millions to a competitor before close of business. The bank manager let him run himself completely dry. Then he delivered the killing blow. He told Bryce there was no system glitch. He stated plainly that Meridian Crest Ventures, the primary guarantor and sole investor of the startup, had executed an emergency unilateral asset seizure at exactly 8 hours that morning. Bryce felt his throat clamp shut. His voice fractured as he argued that they couldn't legally do that without a formal board of directors vote. He shouted that he was the chief executive officer and demanded the freeze be lifted at once. The bank manager calmly explained that a board vote was not required when a level 4 breach of contract protocol had been triggered. Bryce's grip tightened on the edge of his mahogany desk. He demanded to know what the supposed breach of contract was. The manager audibly shuffled papers on his end of the line. He read directly from the legal injunction filed that morning by my attorney Stuart Aldrich. He stated that Meridian Crest Ventures was exercising its absolute rights under Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Founder Agreement, specifically the Morality and Ethical Conduct Clause. The manager cleared his throat and read the precise legal justification aloud. He stated that the holding company was executing an immediate freeze of all operating capital, pending an active police investigation into felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and gross moral turpitude. Those words hung in the air of Bryce's expensive corner office like a death sentence. Elder abuse, aggravated assault. The bank manager asked whether Bryce needed the police incident report number associated with the financial freeze. Bryce's cell phone dropped onto the desk. The line was still open, the manager's voice buzzing faintly from the speaker, but Bryce could not produce a single word. The invisible corporate holding company knew exactly what he had done in my basement. The full weight of that realization came crashing down on him like a collapsing building. The holding company that owned his entire business was called Meridian Crest Ventures. The trust that had just legally evicted him from his home was called Meridian Crest Commercial Trust. The mysterious billionaire investor he had been boasting about to friends for 3 full years was the exact same old man he had abandoned to die on a freezing concrete floor. I was Meridian Crest. While Bryce stood completely frozen behind his desk, the second phase of the destruction protocol kicked in automatically. The indicator lights on his high-speed internet router flickered violently and then held solid red. His computer screen went dead black. A wall of scrolling white text filled it as the servers hosting his prize software were physically and digitally locked down by my cybersecurity team. The proprietary code he was convinced would make him famous was instantly encrypted and sealed behind an impenetrable digital wall. He was shut out of his own creation entirely. He rushed to his office door and threw it open. The open floor plan of his startup was collapsing into chaos. His lead software developers were on their feet, staring in bewilderment at blank monitors. The receptionist was in a loud argument with 3 broad-shouldered men in dark charcoal suits who had just stepped off the elevators. They were corporate auditors, accompanied by private security contractors, all hired directly by Stuart Aldrich. The lead auditor crossed the floor without acknowledging the panicked employees, walked straight up to Bryce, pressed a thick legal binder into his hands, and demanded his building access card on the spot. Bryce tried to puff out his chest. He attempted to assert authority and ordered the men off his property. The largest security contractor simply moved forward, placed a heavy hand on Bryce's shoulder, and informed him that he was currently trespassing on Meridian Crest property. Bryce was frog-marched out of his own office, paraded in front of his stunned employees, who watched their imperious boss escorted out like a common criminal. He was not permitted to grab his coat. He was not allowed to take his silver laptop or retrieve his car keys from the desk. He was put into the public elevator and sent down to the street with nothing but the clothes on his back. Back in my secure recovery suite, my cell phone buzzed on the table beside me, a secure text from Stuart Aldrich. 2 words, target neutralized. I smiled, lifted my cup of black coffee, and took a long, slow sip. Bryce had walked into that building as a king preparing to dominate the world. He was thrown out onto the pavement 10 minutes later as a completely broken man. He had no money to retain a lawyer, no money to cover his rent. He couldn't even scrape together enough for a cup of coffee. The parasite had been surgically cut from the host, and his starvation was now fully underway. Bryce did not drive his leased sports car back to my estate. He couldn't. The vehicle required a digital authorization key tied directly to his corporate executive account. While he was riding the elevator down to the street level, my cybersecurity team had remotely deactivated his profile. When Bryce reached the underground parking garage, the car refused to unlock. His corporate platinum card was declined at the automated taxi stand outside the building. His personal bank card was declined when he tried to book a premium rideshare on his phone. The man who had strutted into that office building, convinced he was an industry titan, was forced to walk 2 miles through the afternoon heat to a public bus stop. He had to beg a city transit driver to let him board for free because his expensive leather wallet held nothing but dead plastic. When Bryce finally pushed through the heavy mahogany front door of my home, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. He stumbled into the grand foyer, his tailored British suit soaked in sweat and gray with city dust. Nadine was on the custom velvet sofa in the living room, drumming her designer fingernails anxiously against her phone screen. She took one look at her husband's pale, hollowed face and immediately demanded to know what the lawyers had said. She asked how quickly they could file an injunction against the commercial trust and get the house back on the market. Bryce dropped into the armchair across from her. He couldn't even bring himself to meet her eyes. He fixed his gaze on his expensive shoes and delivered the news in a hollow, shaking voice. He told her there were no high-powered lawyers coming. He told her the business operating accounts were completely frozen. The executive credit lines had been canceled, and the software servers physically locked down. He finally raised his eyes to meet his wife's, his face a mask of absolute terror, and delivered the most devastating truth of all. He told her that the anonymous billionaire investor they had treated like a god for the past 3 years was no stranger. It was her father. It was me. Nadine went still. The color drained from her face completely. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a dry gasp. Bryce pressed on his voice, cracking with raw panic. He explained that my holding company had triggered a severe morality clause. He told her that I knew precisely what they had done in that basement. I had somehow engineered this entire financial slaughter from a hospital bed. They were broke utterly and completely. They didn't have enough money to buy a single loaf of bread, let alone retain a corporate defense attorney to go up against a billionaire trust. Nadine's initial shock curdled fast into a blinding, venomous rage. She absolutely refused to accept that this was over. Her sheer arrogance would not allow her to believe that the old man she had pushed down a flight of stairs had outmaneuvered her so completely. She shot up from the velvet sofa and began pacing the living room like a caged animal. She shouted that I was bluffing. She screamed that I was nothing but a weak, senile old man throwing a pathetic temper tantrum. She talked herself into believing I was still lying in that hospital bed, heavily medicated and firmly under her legal control. She grabbed her cell phone off the coffee table. She snapped at Bryce to stop crying like a child. She declared that she still held the medical and financial power of attorney. She was going to call the hospital administration. Right now, she said, order the doctors to declare me legally incompetent and force the bank to unfreeze the accounts under her authority. She dialed the main hospital number, her hands trembling with adrenaline and fury. The phone rang 3 times before a senior administrative nurse picked up. Nadine skipped any greeting entirely. She launched straight into a vicious, demanding tirade. She identified herself as the legal guardian and sole power of attorney for Gerald Whitmore. She insisted on being transferred to my recovery room immediately. She shouted that she needed to speak to the attending physician that very second to authorize a forced psychiatric evaluation. The nurse on the other end remained perfectly composed, entirely unmoved by Nadine's hysterical demands. She asked Nadine to hold for a moment while she pulled up the digital patient records. The silence on the line stretched for 30 agonizing seconds. Nadine drummed her foot impatiently, shooting daggers at Bryce, with her eyes silently assuring him that her aggression was about to fix everything he had managed to destroy. The nurse came back on the line. Her voice was ice-cold and purely professional. She informed Nadine that Gerald Whitmore was no longer a registered patient at their facility. Nadine's foot stopped moving. Her grip tightened on the phone until her knuckles went white. She demanded to know what that meant. She asked whether I had been transferred to the low-income state nursing home ahead of schedule. She pressed for the address of the new facility immediately. The nurse corrected her with calm, bureaucratic precision. She stated that Gerald Whitmore had not been transferred to any state facility. She explained that at exactly midnight, I had been formally discharged against medical advice. I had left the hospital, or rather been transported out in a private medical vehicle accompanied by my own personal legal counsel. Nadine completely lost control. She screamed into the phone that the hospital had committed a massive illegal act. She shouted that she held the medical power of attorney, and the staff had no right whatsoever to release a severely injured, mentally incompetent patient without her direct written consent. She threatened to sue the hospital, the nursing staff, and the entire medical board for criminal negligence and malpractice. The nurse didn't flinch at a single word. She simply read directly from the legal notes attached to my updated file. She informed Nadine that a private notary and a senior corporate attorney had come to my room at midnight. She stated clearly that I had executed a legally binding, fully notarized revocation of all prior power of attorney documents. The papers Nadine was currently holding, she said, were completely void and legally worthless. Beyond that, the nurse explained my new legal representative, Stuart Aldrich, had placed a strict privacy block across my entire medical record. The hospital was legally prohibited from revealing my location, my medical status, or any further information to anyone, specifically including my daughter. Before Nadine could launch another threat, the nurse offered a polite good day and ended the call. The line went dead. Nadine slowly lowered the phone from her ear. Her hand was shaking so badly she dropped it onto the hardwood floor. It landed with a sharp crack. She didn't even glance down. The full reality of her situation finally tore through every last delusion she had been clinging to. I was not trapped. I was not sedated. I was gone entirely. I had disappeared without a trace, leaving her standing in my living room, clutching a folder full of worthless paper. She looked at Bryce. The enormous house felt suddenly silent and cold around them. They were completely isolated. No money, no business, no legal claim over me whatsoever, and worst of all, no idea where I was or what was coming next. The net had closed all the way around them. Pure, undiluted panic set in. Bryce rose from the armchair, his breathing shallow and quick. He gestured toward the massive bay windows, looking out over the front driveway. He brought up the eviction notice the real estate broker had mentioned. He said the commercial trust would be sending law enforcement to remove them from the property before long. He told her they should pack whatever they could carry and leave before it got worse. But Nadine's greed was a fatal, incurable condition. Even staring straight into total ruin, she could not release her grip on the wealth she believed was rightfully hers. She let her eyes travel around the grand living room, taking in the high vaulted ceilings and the expensive art on the walls. She told Bryce they were absolutely not going anywhere. She reasoned that corporate eviction procedures take considerable time. It would take months, she claimed, for a trust to work through the housing courts and legally remove them from a residential property. She laid out a desperate, entirely illegal plan. They were going to squat in my $2 million estate. She told Bryce to go down to the garage and dig out his heavy toolbox. She ordered him to replace every single lock on the front, rear, and side doors. She told him to nail the basement windows shut from the inside. She declared that this house was her castle, and she had no intention of surrendering it to a faceless corporation without a fight. She also recognized they needed cash immediately just to get through the week. Their credit cards were dead, and their bank accounts held exactly $0. Nadine's gaze settled on my collection of antique furniture, my vintage Turkish rugs, and the glass display case in the study, holding my rare vintage watches. A desperate, predatory smile crossed her face. She told Bryce they were going to host a massive cash-only estate sale that coming weekend. They were going to illegally offload every valuable item in my home to willing buyers before the authorities could remove them. It was a reckless, deeply criminal move, driven by pure desperation and insatiable greed. It was exactly the move I knew they would make. It was the perfect setup for the final trap I had already laid for them. Saturday morning arrived with bright sunshine. My house, the property now legally held by a commercial trust, had been completely transformed. Nadine and Bryce had spent the preceding 48 hours ransacking my personal possessions like scavengers. They were cut off from the banking system entirely. Their credit cards were useless. They were desperate for liquid cash to survive the week and to fund lawyers to fight the trust. Their solution, brilliant in their own desperate minds, was to stage a massive cash-only estate sale dressed up as an exclusive weekend cocktail party. Through the high-definition security cameras concealed in the ceilings, I watched the complete desecration of my life's work. Nadine had hired a budget catering company using the very last dollars she had scraped from the emergency cash drawer in my kitchen. Waiters moved through my living room, balancing trays of cheap champagne. The house was packed with dozens of wealthy, entirely unsuspecting buyers from the surrounding neighborhood. These people believed they were attending a chic liquidation event. They had no idea whatsoever that they were active participants in the mass fencing of stolen property. Nadine was positioned near the grand fireplace in one of her most expensive designer dresses, crystal glass in hand, playing the role of the grief-stricken, devoted daughter with flawless precision. I listened through the hidden microphones as she fed lies directly to a cluster of potential buyers. She told them her poor father had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She claimed I had been permanently relocated to a specialized memory care facility, and that she was simply selling off the estate to cover my astronomical medical bills. The buyers nodded with genuine sympathy, and then eagerly pressed thick stacks of $100 bills into her hands in exchange for my possessions. I watched her sell the antique mahogany writing desk I had brought back from Paris 30 years ago, sold to a local doctor for $4,000 in cash. She had no idea that desk contained the original blueprints for my first logistics warehouse. To her, it was just a heavy piece of old wood standing between her and a new penthouse. She stuffed the cash directly into a designer handbag sitting on the mantel. Her eyes were glassy with pure greed. She genuinely believed she was getting the better of me, that converting my physical belongings into untraceable paper money would give her the firepower she needed to fight the invisible trust. In the adjacent study, Bryce was running his own illegal auction. He looked absolutely wrecked. His expensive suit was visibly rumpled, dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes. The stress of watching his entire software company collapse was eating him alive from the inside. He stood behind my heavy oak desk, desperately haggling with a group of local jewelry collectors. Laid out across the desk was my entire collection of vintage mechanical watches. These were not just timepieces. They were the physical markers of my entire life. The platinum chronograph I bought the day my logistics company went public. The engraved pocket watch my late wife gave me on our 20th anniversary. Bryce cared nothing for any of that history or sentiment. He cared only about keeping his own inflated ego breathing. I watched him haggle aggressively with a buyer over a rare Swiss piece. The buyer offered $8,000. Bryce, sweating through his collar, held out for $10,000, insisting he needed the money immediately to secure a corporate attorney. The buyer hesitated, then pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and counted out $9,000. Bryce snatched the money off the desk with shaking hands and shoved it into a brown leather satchel on the floor beside him. He looked exactly like a desperate criminal, emptying a vault with the sound of sirens in the distance. He kept checking his cell phone obsessively, waiting for the commercial bank to somehow restore his access by some miracle. The invisible wall that had come down on his life had him genuinely terrified. But instead of an ounce of humility or remorse, that fear drove him straight into reckless greed. He turned to the next buyer, lifted my late wife's sapphire pendant necklace I bought her for her college graduation, and auctioned it to the highest bidder without a moment's hesitation. He was selling his mother-in-law's ghost just to hang on to a leased sports car. Miles away, I sat in my secure recovery suite, watching the live video feed on my tablet. My physical therapist had just wrapped up a grueling 2-hour session. My surgically repaired hip was aching with a dull, steady throb, but I had not touched a single prescribed painkiller. I needed my mind sharp and completely clear for the finale of this war. I watched these two parasites strip my life down to the bare walls. A weaker man might have wept, watching his most prized memories sold off for a fraction of their worth. A different father might have called the police right then to put a stop to it. But I did not move a muscle to intervene. I let them pull the oil paintings right off the walls. I let them sell the watches. I let them pack their designer bags with entirely illegal cash. I needed them fully committed to the crime, publicly, visibly, undeniably committed. I needed the house packed with high-profile witnesses. I needed them holding stolen money in their own hands so the criminal charges would be airtight in a courtroom. Every dollar they collected was another loop of the legal noose tightening around their own necks. They were carefully constructing their own prison cell, and I was simply watching the build. The clock on my tablet read 2 in the afternoon. The estate sale was at its absolute peak. The grand living room buzzed with the loud chatter of wealthy buyers comparing their ill-gotten acquisitions. Nadine was laughing at a neighbor's joke, her designer bag straining at the seams with illegal cash. She raised her champagne glass, feeling entirely victorious. In the study, Bryce was zipping up his heavy leather satchel. He exhaled a shaky breath, genuinely convinced he had scraped together enough untraceable money to build a legal team and launch his counterattack against Meridian Crest. They believed they had made it through the worst of the storm. They thought they had found a clever gap in my trap. My trap had no gaps, only steel teeth. Then the entire atmosphere inside the living room shifted without warning. The loud, self-satisfied chatter began to die out quickly. The wealthy buyers gathered near the massive bay windows fell silent and started pointing toward the front of the property. Through the exterior driveway camera feed, I saw what they were seeing, something large rolling toward the house. Nadine caught the sudden quiet. She stopped laughing mid-sentence and turned her head toward the front of the property. The smug, triumphant smile dissolved from her face in a matter of seconds. Bryce came out of the study, clutching the leather satchel tightly against his side. He read the energy shift in the room, instantly looked out through the large glass window, and his jaw went slack. A massive heavy-duty commercial moving truck had turned onto my private driveway, but it hadn't come alone. Following close behind it was a tight convoy of 3 sleek, entirely black sport utility vehicles. They didn't stop at the street out of courtesy. They rolled aggressively up the long driveway and boxed in the luxury cars belonging to the estate sale guests without a second thought. The trap was no longer a hidden financial mechanism working in silence. It was physically pulling up to the front door. The heavy diesel engine of the moving truck rumbled with a deep vibration that rattled the expensive glass of the living room windows. The 3 matte black SUVs fell in tight behind it in a deliberate, aggressive formation. They didn't pull up neatly along the curb. They drove straight across the manicured front lawn, heavy tires grinding through the landscaping, and formed an impenetrable wall of metal that completely sealed in every luxury sedan and sports car belonging to the guests. The trap had arrived in the flesh. The mood inside the house flipped from loud celebration to suffocating dread in a matter of seconds. The wealthy doctors, local politicians, and neighborhood gossips set down their champagne and pressed toward the bay windows, pointing. Nadine's crystal glass slipped from her hand. It struck the hardwood floor and burst into jagged pieces. She didn't even look down, her face drained to the color of ash. The triumphant smile she had worn all morning was gone, replaced by sheer, undiluted panic. Bryce stood completely frozen in the study doorway, still clutching the heavy satchel, loaded with thousands of dollars in illicit cash, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He knew exactly what those black vehicles represented. He had watched these same corporate security contractors physically march him out of his own software company just 2 days ago. He knew this was no accident. This was the invisible hand of Meridian Crest reaching out to crush the very last refuge he had left in the world. 12 men stepped out of the black vehicles simultaneously. They were not local police officers. They wore no standard blue uniforms and carried none of the patient manner of public servants. They were dressed in identical tactical charcoal suits with discreet communication earpieces tucked behind their ears. They moved with terrifying synchronized military precision, fanning out to cover the perimeter of the house, taking positions at the front door, the side gates, and the backyard patio. They were a private corporate asset recovery team, and they looked like an army of executioners setting up for a siege. The lead agent stepped out from the center vehicle. He was a tall, heavily built man with iron gray hair and a face cut from stone. He did not look angry. He looked thoroughly bored, which made him infinitely more frightening. A thick metallic clipboard rested in his left hand. He climbed the stone porch steps in slow, deliberate strides. His heavy boots struck the hardwood with each step, the sound carrying like the tick of some enormous clock winding down toward total catastrophe. Nadine scrambled desperately to reclaim command of the moment. Her inflated ego simply couldn't process the fact that she was completely outclassed. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, plastered her rehearsed smile back in place, and threw the front door wide open before the agent had even raised his hand to knock. She squared her shoulders and attempted to project the confident authority of a woman who owned everything in sight. She demanded loudly to know who these people were and what gave them the right to barge into her private weekend cocktail party. She threatened to phone the mayor personally and have the whole lot of them hauled in for trespassing. The lead agent didn't flinch. He gave her theatrical outrage not a single moment of consideration. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her and stared down at her with open contempt. He made no effort to lower his voice or offer her the courtesy of a private word. Instead, he spoke loudly and with perfect clarity, making certain that every wealthy guest gathered in the foyer and living room caught every syllable. He identified himself as Agent Caslow, Regional Director of Asset Recovery for Meridian Crest Commercial Trust. Nadine's mouth flew open to argue, but Agent Caslow shut her down before the first word cleared her lips. He raised the heavy metallic clipboard. He announced to the utterly silent room that the property they were all standing inside was the lawful possession of a commercial corporation. He stated that the prior owner, Gerald Whitmore, had legally transferred the deed before his medical discharge. He turned his gaze directly toward the wealthy guests, clutching my antique furniture, my expensive paintings, and my late wife's jewelry. Then he delivered a legal warning that detonated in the room like a shockwave. Agent Caslow informed the crowd that Nadine and Bryce held absolutely no legal authority to sell a single item inside this house. He made it plain that every transaction conducted here today was entirely fraudulent. He explained that acquiring corporate assets from unauthorized individuals constituted the felony receipt of stolen property. He told the terrified guests that they were active participants in a large-scale illegal fencing operation, and were at that very moment holding stolen corporate evidence in their own hands. The reaction was immediate and utterly chaotic. These were people who guarded their spotless reputations above everything else. The mere suggestion of felony charges and stolen property sent them spiraling into a frenzy. A prominent local surgeon dropped the antique vase he'd just purchased, as if his fingers had gone numb. A wealthy socialite frantically unhooked the sapphire pendant necklace from around her neck and flung it onto the nearest table as though it were burning her skin. The guests grasped in an instant that they had been thoroughly conned. They turned their collective fury entirely on Nadine and Bryce. Dozens of furious people began screaming at my daughter. They demanded their cash back on the spot. They called her a thief and a fraud. Nadine retreated from the doorway with both hands raised in a futile gesture of defense, completely overwhelmed by the savage hostility of her own country club circle. She stumbled through some stammered excuse about a massive misunderstanding, but no one had any interest in her lies anymore. The illusion of her extravagant life was ripped away entirely, leaving exposed the pathetic, desperate criminal hiding beneath the designer clothes. In the thick of the chaos, Bryce made a catastrophic choice. The pressure shattered something in him completely. He stared at the heavy leather satchel in his grip, stuffed with nearly $30,000 in untraceable cash, the last money he had left anywhere in the world. He turned his back on the living room and bolted toward the kitchen, aiming to slip out through the back door and disappear into the dense woods behind the property. He gave no thought to his wife. His only concern was saving himself. He crashed through the swinging kitchen doors and ran straight into a wall of solid muscle. 2 corporate security agents had already locked down the rear exit. They seized Bryce by the shoulders and drove him hard into the stainless steel refrigerator. The collision knocked the wind clean out of him. The heavy leather satchel slipped from his damp fingers and hit the tile, splitting open on impact. Thick stacks of $100 bills tumbled out, scattering across the kitchen floor in every direction. One agent held Bryce pinned against the appliance, while the other calmly crouched down and began gathering up the scattered bills. That agent informed Bryce that the cash was being formally seized as direct evidence of illicit corporate theft. Bryce strained weakly against the agent's iron grip, tears of pure terror and frustration cutting down his face. He sobbed openly, begging them to leave him even a few $100s so he could eat. The agents paid his pleading no mind whatsoever. Back in the front hallway, Agent Caslow stepped past a completely frozen Nadine. He moved to the center of the living room and issued one final command to the panicked crowd. He ordered anyone who did not reside in the house to vacate the premises immediately. He warned that anyone still inside the property in exactly 2 minutes would be detained and turned over to local police for criminal processing. The guests didn't pause for even a heartbeat. They practically ran over one another, pouring out the front door, abandoning their purchases and leaving their cash where it lay. They sprinted across the lawn toward their blocked luxury vehicles, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the radioactive wreckage of my daughter's life. Nadine was left standing alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by abandoned antiques and stone-faced security contractors. The estate sale was finished, and the final reckoning had officially come. The stampede of fleeing guests sent a wave of panic rippling across my front lawn. Luxury cars reversed recklessly over the manicured grass, frantic to break free of the corporate blockade. But the mass exodus lurched to a sudden halt. A heavy quiet settled over the property as a large custom medical transport van rolled slowly up the center of the driveway, carving a path through the cluster of black security vehicles. The van came to a stop directly in front of the grand entrance. The rear doors swung open with a solid metallic clack, and a mechanized hydraulic ramp descended slowly to the pavement. I did not look like the broken, hollowed-out old man they had abandoned on a freezing concrete floor. I did not look like the frightened victim trembling in a hospital bed. I was dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that covered my heavy medical bandages. I sat perfectly upright in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. I guided the chair down the ramp with practiced ease. Stuart Aldrich walked close at my side, a thick leather binder tucked under his arm. Two imposing private security contractors flanked me, their hands resting with deliberate calm near their utility belts. The guests who had lingered too long in shock to flee stood rooted to the lawn, staring at me as though they couldn't trust their own eyes. Nadine was on the front porch. The stolen cash from the estate sale was the last thing on her mind. Her eyes were stretched wide with a terror so raw, it looked as though she were staring at a ghost. In many ways, she was. The father she had known was gone entirely. The man rolling up her driveway was the chief executive of her absolute destruction. I steered my wheelchair along the smooth concrete path toward the front steps. I stopped exactly 10 feet from my daughter. The front door opened behind her. Two corporate agents marched Bryce out onto the porch, his arms pinned firmly behind his back. His expensive suit was a ruin. His face was streaked with tears and sweat. He looked down at me in the wheelchair, and his entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. The full crushing magnitude of his miscalculation had finally landed. I looked out across my property. I saw my antique chairs left carelessly on the lawn. I saw my late wife's silver tea set shoved into a cardboard box. A surge of cold, calculated anger moved through me, but I kept my voice level. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. I spoke with the quiet, measured authority of a man holding every card in the deck. I told Nadine the estate sale was officially canceled. Stuart Aldrich stepped forward. He opened the leather binder and drew out a thick stack of heavily stamped legal documents. He passed them to me. I held the packet up so Nadine and Bryce could clearly see the golden seals of the state court. I told them these were nothing like the fraudulent downloaded forms they had coerced me into signing in that hospital room. I explained that what I was holding was an immediate court-ordered eviction notice for the property they were currently trespassing on. Beyond that, I held the fully executed asset seizure warrants for Meridian Crest Ventures. I looked directly into Bryce's bloodshot eyes. I told him I had already liquidated his corporate accounts. I told him his software servers had been physically seized and his building access permanently revoked. I watched the final trace of hope drain completely from his face. He buckled to his knees right there on the wooden porch, sobbing without restraint, pleading with the security guards to release him. But Nadine was an entirely different breed of monster. Her greed and arrogance ran so deep that she was constitutionally incapable of accepting defeat. Even with a private army surrounding her and financial ruin closing in from every direction, she would not yield. She glanced at the cluster of wealthy neighbors and country club gossips watching the scene play out from the edge of the lawn. She spotted an audience and she went straight to work. She arranged her face into an expression of absolute hysterical heartbreak. She erupted into loud theatrical sobbing. She moved a step toward my wheelchair, arms extended as though she meant to embrace me. The security contractors moved instantly, planting themselves in front of me and forming a solid wall of muscle that cut off her path entirely. Nadine stopped and dramatically buried her face in both hands. She wailed at full volume, making sure the entire neighborhood heard every word. She cried out that I was suffering a severe mental breakdown. She shouted to the onlookers that I was a deeply sick, senile old man who had walked out of a psychiatric ward. She insisted the medications had demolished my mind and that I had engaged these so-called security guards during a bout of paranoid dementia. She leveled a trembling finger at Stuart Aldrich. She accused him of being a corrupt, predatory lawyer, preying on a mentally incompetent senior citizen. She screamed that she was my legal guardian and demanded that someone phone the real police to have me safely returned to the hospital before I could harm myself. She played the victim with such terrifying conviction that a handful of the neighbors still lingering on the lawn actually began to murmur in sympathy. They looked at me, sitting in that wheelchair, and wondered whether the weeping beautiful daughter might be telling the truth. Then she looked at me through her manufactured tears. She let her voice drop to a venomous whisper, pitched for my ears only. She told me I was completely pathetic. She said no judge alive would take the word of a deranged old man over a devoted daughter. She promised me that the moment the real authorities showed up, she would have me sealed in a padded cell for whatever was left of my miserable life. She genuinely believed she could still outmaneuver me with a few counterfeit tears and a loud voice. I didn't interrupt her performance. I let her spin out her web of lies. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. I watched her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. I told her she was a remarkable actress. I acknowledged her gift for looking a room full of people straight in the eye and lying without a flicker of hesitation. But I told her the performance had one fatal flaw. I explained that, in the world we now lived in, words cost nothing but high-definition digital data was absolutely priceless. I reached into the side pocket of my wheelchair and drew out a sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen and connected the device to the central smart home hub that controlled the large wireless speakers installed throughout the property. I had bought and installed that sound system years earlier to enjoy jazz music on the patio. Tonight, it was going to serve a far darker purpose. Nadine's crying stopped. She fixed her eyes on the tablet in my hand, and a new entirely real kind of fear began to creep into her expression. The stage was perfectly set for the final lethal blow. The murmurs of the panicked crowd hung in the warm afternoon air. Nadine still had her face buried in her hands, forcing out tears, waiting for the wealthy neighbors to surge forward and console her. She was a practiced manipulator, betting everything on the standard social assumption that people will always side with a weeping, distraught woman over a disabled old man. She believed she could dictate the entire narrative, but she had fundamentally misread the battlefield. We were no longer contesting in the subjective arena of emotion and public opinion. We had moved into the cold, unforgiving territory of hard digital evidence. I sat perfectly still in my motorized wheelchair, the sleek silver tablet resting on my lap. I had no interest in raising my voice to argue against her accusations. I had no desire to desperately persuade the onlookers that I was in full command of my faculties. Meeting a frantic liar's claims head-on only lends their lies a credibility they haven't earned. Instead, I simply tapped the network settings icon on the screen. I looked out at the crowd and spoke with a calm, steady authority that cut cleanly through Nadine's theatrical sobbing. I told the silent onlookers that when my wife passed away 5 years ago, I found myself alone in a large empty estate. For my own peace of mind, I had engaged a premium private security firm to outfit the entire property with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. I had high-definition cameras and highly sensitive omnidirectional microphones installed in the hallways, the living room, and the basement. The entire recording system was integrated directly into the central smart home network. Bryce and Nadine were aware of the basic alarm keypad near the front door, but they had written me off as a clueless old man who could barely work a television remote. They had no idea whatsoever that every corner of this house was continuously capturing audio and video data to an encrypted cloud server. I swiped my finger across the tablet. A sharp, clear electronic chime rang out from the large outdoor speakers mounted under the wooden eaves of the front porch. The same chime resonated from the living room and the study inside the house. The entire property had synced successfully to my personal device. The house itself was about to testify against them. The moment Nadine heard the Bluetooth connection chime, her manufactured sobbing cut off completely. Her hands fell away from her face. Her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble. She stared at the outdoor speakers, then slowly turned her gaze directly toward me. The sociopathic mask of the victim shattered in an instant, exposing the raw, naked terror hiding just beneath. She understood in that moment what I was holding. She understood that the basement stairwell had not been a silent, unrecorded tomb. I faced the crowd of wealthy neighbors directly. I told them that my daughter had just stood on this porch and declared me a senile man gripped by severe delusions. I told them she had just sworn she was a devoted, loving caregiver, doing nothing more than protecting her ailing father. I asked them to listen very carefully to the truth. I told them they were about to hear exactly what took place on Thursday afternoon, just minutes before Nadine and Bryce left for a luxury anniversary vacation in Sonoma Valley. I pressed play on the glass screen. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the faint static of ambient room noise. Then the crisp, undeniable audio from the basement camera began broadcasting across the entire estate. The volume was set perfectly, carrying the voices out clearly across the manicured lawn. The crowd heard Nadine's voice first. It bore no resemblance to the fragile weeping voice she had just used to beg for their sympathy. It was cruel and harsh, saturated with contempt. The massive speakers delivered her demands to every person on that lawn. They heard her mock my age. They heard her aggressively inform me that my slight limp was a liability and order me to sign over the deed to my house. They heard me refuse. They heard me tell them both to pack their things and get off my property. The wealthy onlookers stood frozen in collective shock. The local socialite who had been murmuring in Nadine's defense just moments before covered her mouth with both hands. The prominent surgeon who had purchased my writing desk stared at the speakers as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The grand illusion of the devoted daughter was instantly and completely incinerated, but the recording wasn't finished. What was coming next was far worse. The speakers broadcast the heavy sound of my footsteps moving toward the hallway phone. Then came the abrupt, violent noise of physical force. The crowd heard Nadine grunt as she drove her full weight into me. They heard my sharp, startled gasp. What followed was a sound that caused several people in the crowd to visibly flinch. The heavy booming audio captured the sickening thud of my body striking the top wooden step. It captured the chaotic, violent tumbling as I went backward down the steep stairwell. The microphones caught the wrenching crack of my ribs connecting with the wooden railing. And then the recording delivered its most devastating moment, the bone-crushing impact of my body slamming into the solid concrete floor at the bottom of the basement. A woman, somewhere in the crowd, let out a piercing, horrified gasp. Complete silence followed the terrible crash on the recording. Only my ragged, agonized wheezing carried through the porch speakers the unmistakable sound of an injured man fighting to stay alive in absolute darkness. On the porch, Bryce was sobbing without control, thrashing feebly against the iron grip of the corporate security agents. He was begging me to turn the audio off. He was screaming that he was desperately sorry, but I left the tablet exactly where it was. I made him stand there and listen to his own condemnation play out in full. The digital recording kept going. The crowd heard careful footsteps drawing toward the top of the stairs. They heard the floorboards creak as Bryce and Nadine peered down at my broken body lying below. The silence on the tape stretched for 5 agonizing seconds while they decided what to do with me. Then Bryce's voice rang out across the lawn, crisp clear, and completely stripped of any recognizable human compassion. The high-end speakers broadcast his exact chilling words without mercy. Maybe now he will get the message. Let him die down there. The crowd broke into loud murmurs of absolute revulsion. The final sound on the recording was the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt, sealing me inside the freezing basement, followed by the muffled sound of their luxury car pulling away toward wine country. I pressed a button on the screen, and the audio cut off completely. The silence that settled over the property was heavier than lead. It was the silence of total, inescapable judgment. I looked at my daughter. She was no longer standing with any trace of pride on that porch. Her knees had given out entirely. She had slid down against the wooden railing until she was sitting on the dirty floorboards, staring blankly at the grass with her mind completely shattered. There were no manufactured tears left to produce. There were no more lies left to construct. Her social standing, her spotless reputation, and her entire financial future had just been publicly executed in front of the most influential people in her city. The wealthy neighbors regarded her the way you'd look at something diseased. The very people who had been drinking her cheap champagne, not 20 minutes earlier, were now stepping backward, actively working to put as much physical distance between themselves and her as they could manage. She had been fully exposed as a violent sociopathic parasite who had literally left her own father to bleed out on a concrete floor so she could take his house. I slid the silver tablet back into the side pocket of my wheelchair. I had nothing left to say to the horrified crowd. The digital evidence had done all the talking. The silent adjustment was officially complete. I had not laid a single finger on either of them. I had not thrown a punch or raised my voice in anger. I had simply held up a mirror and forced the entire world to confront the absolute darkness living inside their souls. The lethal blow had landed perfectly, and the monsters were finally permanently slain. The heavy silence following the recording was suddenly broken by the sound of a crystal vase hitting the driveway and shattering. One of the wealthy neighbors had simply let the stolen antique fall from her hands. She didn't bend down to collect the pieces. She didn't ask for her money back. She turned away from Nadine and walked briskly toward her car. That single act broke the spell entirely. The remaining guests dissolved into a frantic, uncoordinated stampede of self-preservation. These were people who had built their entire lives around social status, local political connections, and spotless public reputations. The sudden understanding that they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene, holding stolen property, while listening to a recorded attempted murder, sent them into complete panic. They dropped everything immediately. Expensive oil paintings were left propped against the manicured hedges. Vintage silver platters were abandoned carelessly on the front lawn. The wealthy socialites and prominent businessmen practically climbed over one another, trying to put distance between themselves and my daughter. Not one of them offered Nadine a word of comfort. They treated her as though she were highly contagious. The private corporate security agent stepped aside and opened a clear path for the departing guests, but kept a sharp eye on everything left behind. Not a single person was stopped from leaving the property, but not one piece of my legacy was permitted to leave the estate with them. I sat in my wheelchair and watched the elaborate illusion of my daughter's social life dissolve into nothing. For 3 years, she had constructed her entire identity around impressing these shallow people. She had purchased their friendship with my money. She had thrown their lavish parties on my credit cards. She had hungered for their approval at every turn, and now, the instant the truth was laid bare, they walked away without a single backward glance. The luxury sedans and sports cars that had been boxed in by the black security vehicles were now threading frantically through my ruined landscaping. Expensive tires gouged deep trenches in the lawn as the guests squeezed past the corporate blockade. Within 3 minutes, the front lawn that had been packed with the people stood completely empty. Nothing left but the abandoned antiques scattered across the grass and the security team holding the iron perimeter. Nadine remained slumped on the dirty floorboards of the front porch, entirely paralyzed. The reality of her complete social annihilation had short-circuited something inside her. She stared blankly at the torn-up grass mouth slightly open, incapable of processing the full scale of her destruction. Bryce was still pinned against the exterior wall of the house by 2 security agents, his head hanging in the total defeat. Quiet returned to the estate, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the heavy, expectant stillness that gathers before a massive storm. Then a new sound cut through the warm afternoon air. It began as a faint, high-pitched wail drifting up from the main road at the bottom of the long hill. Within seconds it grew louder and unmistakable. It was the aggressive overlapping blare of multiple police sirens closing in at speed. Nadine snapped her head up. The blank stare vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of sheer undiluted terror. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, genuinely pleading for the first time in her life. She understood now that the corporate security team had not been the final punishment. She grasped at last that losing the house, the money, and the social standing had only been the opening phase of her nightmare. The sirens were growing exponentially louder, ricocheting off the surrounding trees and rolling across the property with terrifying clarity. Bryce began thrashing violently against the grip of the security agents. He screamed that he could not go to state prison. He sobbed without control, begging me to call the authorities off. He pleaded that it had all been a terrible mistake, that he never genuinely meant to hurt me, that he had simply been angry and under pressure from his failing business. His pathetic whimpering was completely swallowed by the deafening wall of approaching sirens. I did not feel 1 ounce of pity for him. I watched him with cold, detached calm. The window for apologies had closed the moment he turned that deadbolt and walked away. Stuart Aldrich stepped forward from his position beside my wheelchair. He looked down at Nadine, who was now trembling so violently she could barely hold herself upright against the wooden railing. Stuart straightened his suit jacket and spoke in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had engineered this precise sequence of events down to the very last detail. He told Nadine that the local police department was not responding to a noise complaint or a neighborhood dispute. He explained that exactly 10 minutes before our corporate convoy had pulled through the gates of the estate, he had personally contacted the chief of police. Stewart stated that he had already transmitted the digital audio recording of the basement incident directly and securely to the lead detective of the Criminal Investigation Division. He informed her that he had also delivered the fraudulent hospital documents she had coerced me into signing, which established her deliberate intent to strip my assets while I lay incapacitated. He looked straight into her terrified eyes and delivered the final piece of information. He told her that the officers currently racing up the hill were not coming to ask questions or to mediate a family dispute. They were responding to an active judge-approved felony warrant for aggravated assault, elder abuse, and attempted manslaughter. Nadine opened her mouth, but nothing came out except a dry, rattling gasp. She turned to look at the red and blue lights now strobing violently off the tall trees lining the edge of the driveway. 3 marked police cruisers tore through the open front gate's tires, shrieking as they hit the pavement. They cut aggressively onto the property, boxing and the black security vehicles and sealing off every possible avenue of escape. The trap was fully closed. The financial empire had been dismantled. The stolen property had been recovered. The social standing had been utterly obliterated. Now the final phase of the silent adjustment was climbing out of those police cruisers to collect what was owed. I rested my hands calmly on the armrests of my wheelchair, perfectly positioned to watch my daughter face the full consequences of her own monstrous greed. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the black and white cruisers. They moved with absolute commanding authority, hands resting with deliberate ease on their heavy-duty belts. Behind them, an unmarked gray sedan rolled onto the crushed grass of my front lawn and stopped. The driver's side door swung open and Detective Coffey stepped out into the warm afternoon air. He was the same detective who had come to my hospital room just 2 days earlier, the same man I had lied to about tripping in the dark. He took in the massive private security perimeter, the abandoned antiques strewn across the driveway. And then his eyes found mine as I sat in the motorized wheelchair. He didn't look angry about the deception. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of professional respect moved across his weathered face. He understood immediately that the lie I'd told in that hospital room wasn't fear-talking. It was a deliberate tactical move designed to build an airtight, undeniable case against them. Stuart Aldrich walked down the smooth, concrete path to meet the detective halfway. There were no pleasantries, no handshake. Stuart simply passed Detective Coffey the silver tablet and a thick manila envelope containing the legally voided power of attorney documents. Coffey opened the video file on the screen. The uniformed officers immediately fanned out into a tight perimeter around the front porch, cutting off any chance that Nadine and Bryce might bolt for the dense woods behind the property. I watched Detective Coffey's face as he reviewed the high-definition security footage from my basement stairwell. The bright tablet screen reflected in his sharp, observant eyes. He watched my own daughter press her hands against my chest and drive me backward into the dark. He watched my body break apart against the hard concrete floor. Then, the audio played through the tablet speaker. Coffey heard Bryce deliver his chilling verdict. The detective's jaw tightened. Every trace of professional neutrality drained out of his expression, replaced without hesitation by a look of deep, unambiguous disgust. He handed the tablet back to Stuart Aldrich without a word. Then he turned his full attention to the front porch. Detective Coffey climbed the wooden steps at an unhurried pace. Nadine backed away until her spine pressed against the heavy front door. She raised both hands, her chest heaving with uncontrolled panic. She made one last desperate attempt to revive her shattered victim act. She stammered that the video was completely out of context. She claimed she had simply lost her footing and bumped into me by accident. She jabbed a trembling finger in my direction and shouted that I was a vindictive old man bent on destroying her life because my mind had gone from severe dementia. Detective Coffey didn't break stride for a single moment. He moved directly into her space and locked his hand around her right wrist with a grip like iron. He told her to save her lies for the judge. He wrenched her arm behind her back. Nadine let out a genuine cry of shock as the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped tight around her wrist. The sharp metallic click rang out across the silent property. It was the last sound her freedom would ever make. Coffey secured her other arm, brushing aside her violent thrashing, and clicked the heavy cuffs together. He read her the Miranda rights in a loud, flat monotone that completely buried her hysterical sobbing. He formally charged her with felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and attempted manslaughter. He stated that because she had locked the basement door and left the state while I lay bleeding on a concrete floor, she was additionally being charged with depraved, heart-reckless endangerment. Nadine stopped fighting. Her legs gave out completely. Had the detective not been holding her upright by her arms, she would have crumpled into a heap on the dirty floorboards. The designer dress she had chosen to impress the wealthy neighborhood was by now badly wrinkled and darkened with sweat. Her perfect, glamorous existence was officially finished. Bryce watched his wife get handcuffed with wide, terrified eyes. He understood in that instant that his only surviving option was to throw the woman he had married directly under the bus. The cowardice that had always been the defining feature of his character seized absolute control. He pressed himself against the exterior wall of the house and thrust a finger toward Nadine. He shouted to the officers that he had absolutely nothing to do with the physical assault. He screamed that she was unstable, that she had shoved me in a sudden burst of rage, and that he had been too frightened of her violent temper to call for an ambulance. He actually attempted to position himself as a victim of her domestic manipulation. Nadine's head snapped up. The ultimate betrayal from her own husband ignited a brief, venomous flash of pure hatred in her eyes. She screamed back at him, her voice fracturing with rage. She shouted that locking the door had been his idea entirely. She yelled at the officers that Bryce was the one who said to let me die down there so they could take the house and pour the money into his failing tech startup. They were tearing each other apart right there on my front porch, happily sacrificing their marriage vows in frantic, futile bids to save their own skins. Detective Coffey looked at Bryce with the kind of contempt most people reserve for something they'd scrape off a shoe. He signaled to two of the uniformed officers. They moved quickly up the steps, grabbed Bryce by the shoulders, and spun him around hard. Bryce sobbed and begged as the officers drove him face first into the wooden siding of the house. They yanked his arms behind his back and snapped the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Coffey leaned in close to Bryce's ear and told him that the digital audio had captured his voice, clearly sealing my fate. The detective stated that the legal duty of care laws in this state made Bryce fully culpable for my injuries. He formally arrested Bryce as an accessory to felony elder abuse accessory to attempted manslaughter and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Bryce collapsed into loud, helpless sobbing like a frightened child as the officers patted him down and emptied his expensive pockets. The officers gripped Nadine and Bryce firmly by the arms and started marching them down the wooden steps. This was the ultimate walk of absolute shame. They were paraded past the scattered remnants of their illegal estate sale. They walked past the expensive antique furniture they had so desperately tried to steal from me. They walked. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end, I want to say something directly to you before we part ways. What happened to me, the fall, the cold floor, the silence, while I wondered if anyone would come, that is not something a person walks away from unchanged. It cost me more than broken ribs. It cost me the version of myself that still believed my own child was incapable of that kind of darkness. I believe God allowed me to survive that basement, not just so I could take back what was mine, but so that someone else sitting alone right now might hear this story and find the strength to protect themselves before it's too late. The Lord's timing in all of it was something I couldn't have planned on my own. Here is what I want you to carry away from this. Document everything. Not because you expect the worst from the people you love, but because the truth must have somewhere to live when it is challenged. If someone is pressuring you to sign something while you are weak or afraid, that pressure itself is the warning. Stop, wait. Call someone you trust completely. Never reveal your strategy to the people who have already shown you who they are. Let them believe they are winning while you prepare. And never mistake silence for surrender. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing and let the evidence speak when the moment is exactly right. These are the kinds of father stories and grandpa revenge stories I share on this channel, not for anger, not for bitterness, but because someone out there needs to know that it is never too late to stand back up. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave me a comment telling me what you thought. I genuinely want to know. And if you have not yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, now is a good time. There are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.